Objectification. It's one of those terms that's generously thrown out by youth pastors who are trying to get kids to come to youth group by promising Lego Batman 2 the video game and Pizza Hut. I can't believe I as a 13-year-old fell for this, but I did. I started thinking a lot about the whole topic of objectification ever since the whole Mark Robinson story dropped on CNN last week. So just for context, Mark Robinson is running as a Republican nominee for the governor of North Carolina. And, he kind of sucks as a person. He has gone on to say things such as, there needs to be killing done.
Get mad at me if you want to. Some folks need killing. It's time for somebody to say it. It's not a matter of vengeance. It's not a matter of being mean or spiteful. It's a matter of necessity.
One of my personal favorite quotes from him relates to what he said transgender people should do when they use the bathroom. Find a corner outside. If you're a man on Friday night and all of a sudden on Saturday you feel like a woman and you want to go in the women's bathroom in the mall, you will be arrested or whatever we got to do to you. But don't worry, because if you're confused, you can simply find a corner outside to go. His words, not mine. Oh my god, guys, I just got an email from my statistics professor in like the middle of filming this. He's giving extra credit. Oh, I know you're not watching this, but to my stat professor, you are such a real one. Anyway, the big news that came out of everything last week was some old forum posts that were attributed to Mark Robinson from as recent as 2016. And they're not just any forums, they're forums. So the evidence for all this lies in the fact that he used similar emails, and the way that he tweeted things also reflected a lot of the speech patterns found in the forum posts. Yeah, there was a lot of really weird, disturbing, messed up shit in there. There was one post saying that some people should own slaves. There was another post where he compared himself to being a black Nazi. But as insane as that is for obvious reasons, that's not what I want to focus on for this video specifically. There was one forum post in particular where Mark Robinson just straight up admits to enjoying watching transgender and calling himself a perv. Obviously, Mark Robinson and his campaign has denied this, despite the fact that information technology specialists have offered to help him find out who did this hack or manufactured information as he's claiming it's being done, and he refused to let them do it. I don't know, man. Things aren't necessarily looking good for your case if you're refusing to let people find out who supposedly manufactured this content. It's almost like it wasn't manufactured and you wrote it. Mark, oh my god. An independent report from back in 2022 found that a majority of the people who watched transgender weren't located in big blue cities. They were concentrated in rural Southern America. And obviously there isn't necessarily extensive research on trends of America, considering it's the kind of taboo thing. But this does fit into the larger theory that was proposed back in the 90s and I'll spend today talking about. And that theory is the theory of objectification. While there were certain ideas and generalizations about the woman body, it wasn't until the late 90s when two professors of women and gender studies at a university decided to lay out the formal foundations for what would now become known as the objectification framework. These professors are Barbara L. Fredrickson and Tommy Ann Roberts, who both came from a psychological background. Their goal was to describe how an observer viewed women given societal context and what we've construed women to be. In presenting this theory, the professors write that bodies exist within social and cultural contexts and hence are also constructed through socio-cultural practices and discourses. What the author's getting at here is that bodies, women's especially, should be viewed not just as the objective body, the parts that make up a body, but should be viewed in its entire society. In other words, it's not one person that we view, it's one person compared to multiple people. And even that's a very basic definition. It also refers to the time, the place, the cultural context of whatever's going around. Women in the United States were perceived very differently 100 years ago than they are now. Even 50 years ago, there was some degree of difference. So given the history that Western civilization has traditionally always had patriarchal structures, this theory, basically, it tries to explain how the remnants of these patriarchal structures still infiltrate into our modern understanding of women, and particularly into how we view the woman's body. Objectification is kind of exactly what the word sounds like, making an object out of something. But what this objectification means, at least according to Fredrickson and Roberts, is that women are comprised simply of parts that are to be used for the pleasure and excursion of men, at least in this framework. The common thread running through all forms of sexual objectification is the experience of being treated as a body or collection of body parts valued predominantly for its use to or consumption by others. And I probably should point out that objectification itself isn't inherently sexual, but more often than not, it is. That's the context we do use it in, especially given the whole discussion we're having right now about women and objectification. To use the terminology of Emil Durkheim, there is this sort of collective consciousness, this common belief that everyone in Western society shares, even if subconsciously, that woman is inferior to the man. While obviously a majority of people don't agree with that statement, the power structures that have been established and are still actively being worked on were put in place to favor men. That's part of the reason as to why feminism even exists. In one way, it is to disassemble these systems of oppression for women, but in another way, it's also to bring about a change in the collective unconsciousness. And thankfully, there is progress being made in that field, even if it's being set back by certain people. It's a mess. The thing with this language is that it's almost exclusively been used in describing cisgender women. Where do transgender people fit in? Because it's only been recently that transgender people have felt more comfortable coming out. We need to talk about the other side of this coin of objectification. That's why it's time to switch into discussing transgender women. Do you guys see what I did there? I like transition. Yeah, no, I even put the scripts vinyl. So Fredrickson and Roberts, right? They're both psychologists, and they study how humans see themselves and see others because of functions and processes that our brains do. And this study obviously focused on cisgender women because that was a primary concern of these two researchers. The point I'm trying to make is this. According to them, in relation to cis women, at a psychological level, perhaps the most profound effect of objectifying treatment is that it coaxes girls and women to adopt a peculiar view of self. Objectification theory posits that the cultural milieu of objectification functions to socialize girls and women to, at some level, treat themselves as objects to be looked at and evaluated. Like I mentioned earlier, this research takes context in the place of hundreds of years of Western civilization, which has continuously devalued women in favor of the patriarchy. But if cis women are subjugated to this way of thinking due to centuries of social conditioning and systemic issues that are firmly etched into place, where do trans people exist? And how exactly do transgender people fit into this binary? Well, historically, they simply didn't. It's obvious that for a majority of our history, there was little to no mention of trans people. When there was that outlier case, it was treated as an anomaly of sorts, as a sort of exhibition. Take the story of Christine Jorgensen, a former American GI who was the first American to receive sex reassignment surgery. Due to the way that society was structured at the time, still is structured in this way in many contexts, but especially back then, she herself wasn't necessarily viewed as a trans woman in the same way the trans women are viewed today. By this, I mean that in the general populace, there wasn't a necessary distinction between gender and sex. There were obviously researchers who were studying this, one which I'll get to in a few minutes, but nothing to the extent of what we have today. And this ignorance of transgender identities is ultimately what objectifies Christine. And going back to the theory of objectification that's presented in this paper, Jorgensen is ultimately just reduced to a bunch of body parts. Is she a woman? According to the majority of the population, yes, maybe technically. She passes, she had the surgery. There's no larger ideology at the time that seeks to destroy transgender people in their lives. But in reality, as so far, she's only a woman as her hormones and her genitalia dictate that she's a woman. And we even kind of see this way of thinking trickle into where we are today with transphobia stemming from people within the LGBT community. While it might generally be accepted by queer people that trans women are women, there might be something else to say about a woman who hasn't had facial feminization surgery or hasn't had sex reassignment surgery. And a lot of these things aren't even necessarily conscious. They're more subconscious. Are the trans exclusionary radical feminists, many of which are lesbian, who just outright reject transgender people. But once again, as someone who is within transgender circles, there exists this sort of hushed up about silent seeping transphobia. Part of it is due to internalized transphobia, and part of it is due to externalized transphobia. Something I will get into another day and another topic in a deeper, longer discussion. But the main thing to take away from this is the fact that objectification of body parts in particular is what led us here. And just what exactly can that objectification be traced back to? If you think that it answers men, you wouldn't necessarily be wrong. It just more so has to do with ignorance more than anything, which is obviously perpetuated by men. Rhonda Unger was another one of these very vocal feminists within the field of psychology, and in 1979, she published her seminal piece, Toward a Redefinition of Sex and Gender. If it's a rainy afternoon and you're getting hit by a tropical storm and you don't have anything better to do, I recommend you read this paper. It's definitely interesting. Unger's research was more concerned about the difference between sex and gender, more specifically in the context of how humans individually view other people's gender within the larger society. According to Unger, the use of the term gender serves to reduce assumed parallels between biological and psychological sex, or at least to make explicit any assumptions of such parallels. Gender may be broadened to include both attributions made by others and assumptions and suppositions about one's own properties, which is gender. Once we understand that gender and sex aren't necessarily intrinsically linked, and then there's some sort of societal element that plays into all of this, into how we perceive others and how we perceive ourselves, then we can start to understand this theory of objectification better. More specifically, objectification of trans people. When we separate sex and gender and start looking at gender through this objectification lens, we start to notice how often the gender ascribed to women has been objectified throughout history, from the vast swaths of pop culture. The first one of which is no doubt the novel any freshman has either loved or dreaded reading, Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. If you enjoy this book, either you're getting your doctorates in English, or you're just an incel. The general gist of Catcher in the Rye deals with Holden Caulfield, who's sick of the adult world. He's a jaded teenager who has had too many issues with the adults in America, with the structure of society. I think that the best way to describe Holden Caulfield as a character is nihilism mixed with Peter Pan with a healthy dose of objectification. Throughout all of Catcher in the Rye, when Holden Caulfield isn't complaining about the current state of society, one of the largest things he does, which earns the book its reputation, is objectifying women. Chapter 17 of Catcher in the Rye is where things really start to get to a head with Holden Caulfield and his romantic interest, Sally. The chapter itself actually starts with Holden waiting for Sally while simultaneously objectifying other women. I was way early when I got there, so I just sat down on one of those leather couches right near the clock in the lobby and watched the girls. A lot of schools were home for vacation already, and there were about 1 million girls sitting and standing around waiting for their dates to show up. Girls with their legs crossed, girls with their legs not crossed, girls with terrific legs, girls with lousy legs, girls that looked like swell sightseeing, if you know what I mean. In a way, it was sort of depressing, too, because you kept wondering what the hell would happen to all of them. When you got out of school and college, I mean, you figure most of them would probably marry dopey guys. Guys that always talked about how many miles they could go to gallon in their goddamn cars. Guys that got sore and childish as hell if you beat them at golf, or even just some stupid game like ping pong. Guys are very mean. Guys that never read books. Guys are very boring. But I have to be careful about that. I mean, about calling guys bores. So, aside from the obvious nice guy charade that Holden's putting on, there's this whole objectification motif that's circling throughout this first paragraph. So, this paragraph does a few things specifically. First off, it continues to reinforce the idea that Holden Caulfield is a nice guy, an incel, whatever term you want to use to describe those kinds of people. But more importantly, when we look at this passage through an objectification lens, the meaning of it starts to make sense in a different, clear focus. Holden isn't looking at these women for the sake of them being women. Rather, he's looking at them through a collection of body parts, as it were, following the whole framework of objectification that was outlined earlier. This is evident in how he's obsessed with the girl's legs and describing them. And the purpose of this objectification, as used by J.D. Salinger, is to draw the attention back to the character of Holden Caulfield, a jaded, misunderstood 16-year-old who wants nothing more than to rescue his little sister from the dangers of the real world. I think that the other obvious example would be the seminal 1996 album, Pinkerton, by the rock band Weezer. Pinkerton functions very similarly in Catcher in the Rye as to how it objectifies women. The difference with Pinkerton and how it objectifies women is that it's more regretful than Catcher in the Rye. There's songs on here where Rivers pours out his heart about not being able to date a girl across the sea, or not being able to date a girl who's a lesbian, or having too much sex and being tired of having so much sex with so much women. And objectification in this instance tries to turn women into simple commodities for men. One of the really interesting things about Pinkerton is how there's so much conflict within the album between someone who wants to have real love and someone who just views women as a commodity, as an object, hence objectification. I guess like my whole point in this whole analysis and comparison as it relates to objectification is that objectification of women especially is a common thing in our pop culture. And that's my little quick aside back to like the main actual portion. And that's like my little quick aside back to the main portion of the video. And then this way of thinking trickles into how we treat both cis women and trans women. So this ties us back to the original purpose of this whole video, discussing objectification, specifically modern day objectification of trans women by the Republican Party, and this knucklehead in particular. How does everything we've discussed turn back to people like Mark Robinson? Well, I mean, the objectification framework gives us all a very clear lens to look at this through. Because of society's unwritten rules about sex and gender, and the pre-existing consciousness that comes regarding this, transgender bodies are viewed as nothing more than a perverse or abnormality in the divine creation of two sexes. And when I say this, I am not saying this purely in relation to Christianity or any other major religion that demonizes trans bodies. I'm saying this in relation to atheism too. I mean, J.K. Rowling just went ahead and said that her religion is pretty much anti-transness. The modern day attack on transgender bodies stem from objectification, from seeing bodies purely as a sexual means to some end. I mean, where do transgender people fit into sexual categories? The objectification of trans women is messy. There still is so much research that can be done in this area, both exploring the sociological reasons, the psychological reasons, all of these different factors that contribute to transgender objectification. As to why Mark Robinson seems to enjoy watching transgender while simultaneously demonizing and trying to expel transgender people, could just be very well his own suppression of his sexual identity. I mean, maybe he's bisexual, I don't know. But another possible explanation using the objectification framework is seeing women, trans women in this instance, as objects. They're nothing more, nothing less than objects to be used by him for his personal gratification. And unfortunately, this is something that's pervasive in a lot of Republican cis men places. I mean, look at Grindr and how during the Republican National Convention, Grindr hit kind of peak usage in Michigan. I don't necessarily have a proper conclusion for this video, considering this is done in a more research style presentation. What I do know is that I have a therapy appointment I should probably get going to. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you another time. Bye.